Well, I have to tell you, I still remember the first time I came to Fillmore Street. I had taken a job in San Francisco I didn't really intend to take, and was staying with an old law school friend who lived just above the Haight. He and his wife, and that seemed very much like the San Francisco that I had heard about and read about. But somebody that I worked with said, "Oh, well, you should look at that area around Fillmore Street. That's really a nice neighborhood." And I remember taking the #1 California bus, getting off on this corner at Fillmore in Sacramento, and immediately I thought, wow, this is great. It was so alive. There were people on the sidewalks and businesses, and Sugar's Broiler was still on the corner, and this was a meat market at the time. A couple of you may remember that. Browser Books was still a block north by the Clay Theater in its original home. And the fabulous Filamento was just next door on this side, and Vivande's great eggplant sandwiches, a couple more doors down. So I didn't realize at the time that this was just the latest incarnation of Fillmore Street that I was experiencing. This was the fall of 1986. And so the new Fillmore had just been created a couple of months before that. It was May of 1986. And the first incarnation of what was to become the Fillmore Jazz Festival happened that fall. The first one was in October, so was the second one, but by the third one they had moved it to the 4th of July, where it has stayed ever since. And so it was a sort of a renaissance that I didn't quite realize at the time, that it had started in 1981 when the Elite Cafe opened. The old Asia Cafe turned into the Elite Cafe. Vivande opened that year. Filamento opened that year, and that was the beginning of kind of the modern era on Fillmore Street. We were laughing outside that sometimes people will come by and Fillmore Street, they hear us carrying on about, and remember there was a time when you didn't slow down as you passed Fillmore Street. It wasn't quite the upscale neighborhood it has become in the meantime. But if I had come in the 70s, some of you were here then, then it was still an affordable neighborhood where poets and artists and writers and actors lived. And if it had been the 60s, then it would have been the rock and roll era when the Fillmore Auditorium and Winterland were creating a whole new world of music here. And if it had been the 50s or the 40s, it would have been the Harlem of the West when all the clubs and joints were still open. And if it had been the 20s and the 30s, it would have been a bustling Jewish district with a very robust Japantown and a heavy Filipino population. And if it had been 1906, right after the earthquake and fire, when pretty much everything east of Van Ness was destroyed, then Fillmore Street was the new Market Street, they said, for a while. So there have been a lot of different incarnations on Fillmore Street that I was to learn about. And if you fast forward 100 years to 2006, suddenly David Ish shows up one day. He had created the new Fillmore, as I said, in 1986, and said, "I'm retiring and moving to Thailand. It's your time." He knew that my wife, Barbara Kate Repa, and I had both had sordid pasts in journalism and had settled on us as his successors, whether we wanted to be or not. And so we did, in 2006, take over the new Fillmore, and we've tried to tell the story of the neighborhood every month since then. And we just came to realize a few months ago that, gosh, we've told a lot of good stories through the years, and wouldn't it be fun to put some of them together in a more permanent way? Of course, there are characters that we have known through the 2 or 3 of my favorite lines in the book. One comes from Iris Fuller, who owned Filamento, who says, "I set out to create a good store. It turned out to be a great store," which really is true. And then there's Ruth Dewson, who said to me one day after she was in the nursing home near the end of her life, "Why should I die when all these other assholes are still alive?" You know that was Ruth too, don't you? Or Phil Dean, who ran the hardware store for such a long time and helped so many of us not only find what we needed, but told us what to do with it when we took it home. And still, to this day, is it Friday? To this day, delivers eggs from his hen house in Pacifica on Friday afternoons. A few of us lucky enough to be on the egg list. So we've found a wonderful home in this neighborhood, and we look at it expansively. You know, it's the top of Pacific Heights, it's the bottom of the Fillmore, and sort of everything in between. Somebody suggested, I think kindly, that, you know, we should call this small town in the big city, and that is sort of the idea of it. Somebody else said we should call it from the Gettys to the ghetto. We have divided things into about 8 different sections. One is the story of the neighborhood, which has some history and tales from before. Young Willie Brown campaigning on horseback on Fillmore Street. Maya Angelou, who found her calling in the Fillmore when her name was still Marguerite Johnson. Etta James grew up in the Fillmore. Tells the story about being in a girl gang, going out and beating up white chicks after school every day. Huh? It was a different era, wasn't it?
Yeah.
How about the day they had the ski jump on the Fillmore Hill? Remember when it snowed on the Fillmore Hill? What a ridiculous notion. But if you were there,
Yes.
it was really a special day in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
And then things began to change on Fillmore Street just a very short time ago when Ralph Lauren opened a store here. And this young real estate broker from Los Angeles, David Fishbein, decided that there was a loophole in the chain store ordinance. It only said you couldn't have more than 11 stores in the United States. So why don't I go and get all the international chains that are just coming to the United States? And we've all seen it happen before our very eyes in a very short time when suddenly there were 20 or 30 new fashion shops from around the world and makeup shops from around the world. So I don't think we're too heavy-handed about it all, but you do get the story of what's happened in this neighborhood, particularly during the last 30 years or so. How about Bavandi, huh? How could you resist that smile? Carlos still occasionally writes a story for us and writes beautifully. I like his instruction on how to eat pasta. Americans must learn to eat their pasta in the approved Italian manner. If you ask for a spoon for your pasta when eating in Italy, you will be taken as uninformed, perhaps a tourist. And we found a picture of their pesto with fried oysters. Now that was a great dish. Doesn't it look like a glamorous big city? Huh? This is another one of Daniel's photographs. Well, I guess it is. You know, it just happens to be our neighborhood club. A young Kim Nally.
Oh my.
Kim Nally got her start singing at Harry's on Fillmore Street. Some of you know this story, but Kim had dropped off a demo tape at Harry's with the manager and wanted to sing there. And he called her up one day and said, "I've got an opening on Thursday night, you're on." Well, she was cleaning houses at the time to pay her way through school, and she said, "You know, I've got a house to clean on Thursday night. Could I sing a different night?" He said, "No, this is your chance." So she went to the lady whose house she was cleaning and said, "I need to take off on Thursday night because I have my big chance to sing at Harry's." The lady said, "What are you talking about? That's a one-shot thing. This cleaning gig is steady every week."
So what'd she do?
Went?
She sang at Harry's that night. She's cleaning houses no more. The Boom Boom Room,
Yeah.
in which our great columnist Chris Barnett delves into, was it really John Lee Hooker's club?
Yeah.
And the answer is, sort of. But the booth is still roped off if you go down. John Lee Hooker's booth is still reserved for him. And Xander Andreas, who owns it, says, "He may be dead to you, but he's not dead to me." And on and on. We do include some art. We do include some homes, starting with the Haas Lilienthal house and a tour inside the Getty Mansion, and then all the way down to the night the Victorians moved, just ahead of the wrecking ball,
Yeah.
and they relocated a few of the finest of the Victorians. A young Carlo Medioni was working with the redevelopment agency back in those days. And he says he was there the night they moved. People who live there might be around. I don't see you, and I won't embarrass you if you're here, but Carlos says they got this house and they moved it. I think it was down on Eddy Street. And they had to do it in the middle of the night so they could take down the power lines and take down the wires and get the houses through the street to their new location and put the wires back up before business began the next day. So Carlos says they got this house, this big, beautiful house that's now at, I think, 1737 Webster Street. There it is. They're backing it into place. It was a little too wide. Wouldn't fit into the hole.
Yeah, a couple inches.
So Carlo ran and got a chainsaw and came out the bay window with the chainsaw, at which point the historic preservationist threw herself in front of the chainsaw and wouldn't let the house be damaged. So you can see in this photo, they're sticking 2x4s in between this house and the next house, wedging it into place. People standing around in the street watching it happen. And Shereth Israel, the temple, do you know about this stained glass window in Shereth Israel that shows Moses receiving the 10 Commandments in Yosemite with Half Dome in the background? They knew the promised land when they found it. Right? So James and the checkout line, I don't think we've ever done a story that got more response than James and the express line at the grocery store. There was a man who was widely loved and deserved to be widely loved. This is a little piece that, and still is, that's right. You still see him on the street, and he's still just as warm and wonderful as always. This is a little piece that BK wrote after her mother died. She came, or after her father died, her mother came out for a visit, and had to go to see James in the checkout line, a regular stop on her visits out here. And James asked how she was doing, and she said that, well, her husband had died. It had been a hard time. Let's have coffee, he said. They met for coffee the next morning before James began this. And to the end of her days, she always asked, how's James doing? And still, to this day, on Mother's Day, my wife gets a box of chocolate in the mail from James. And I complained one year that she wouldn't share it with me, and so now he sends me one. 2 boxes of chocolate every Mother's Day in the mail. So those are our kind of heroes in this book. That's our kind of neighborhood. This is our Fillmore, and I know it's the Fillmore that some of you have loved as well. And I think really that it's the Fillmore that has attracted so many of these international high-blown fashion shops and makeup shops. I think it's the history and the richness of the neighborhood that has attracted a lot of still what has going on Fillmore Street, that went on back in the old days, and it is going on still in this neighborhood. I leave you with the toast that we offer in the introduction to the book: to what has been and what is yet to come. Thank you for joining us tonight.